Britain has a parole system built on a simple idea that people can change, that time served, programs completed, and behaviour improved inside a prison should count for something when the question of gradual reintegration into society is raised. That idea is not wrong. Rehabilitation is real. People do change. And the process of supervised temporary release, when applied carefully and to the right people, works. Ian McLaughlin was not the right person. He had killed in 1983. He had admitted to killing again in 1990. He had been convicted of murder in 1992. He had failed open conditions twice during his sentence. And in July 2013, a prison board looked at that file and granted him a day release that ended with a 66-year-old grandfather dead on a kitchen floor in a Hertfordshire village, stabbed to death for the crime of hearing his neighbour in distress and walking over to help. What follows is how that happened and why Graeme Buck never had a chance. McLaughlin's first killing, Len Delgatti, 1983. Ian McLaughlin was 25 years old in 1983 when he killed for the first time. His victim was Len Delgatti, a 49-year-old man from Stoke Newington in North London. McLaughlin beat Delgatti over the head with a hammer multiple times, strangled him with a towel, and hid the body inside a cupboard. He then continued living his life. He used Delgatti's credit card. He drove around. It was only when McLaughlin crashed a car while drunk and police found the dead man's credit card on him that anyone even knew Len Delgatti was gone. That detail matters. McLaughlin did not confess. He did not hand himself in. He was caught by accident because he got drunk and crashed a vehicle with stolen property in his pocket. Without that crash, Len Delgatti might have stayed in that cupboard indefinitely. At the Old Bailey in 1984, McLaughlin was convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter. He received a 10-year sentence, which was later reduced to 8 years on appeal. He served 5 years and was released on licence in 1989. He was 31 years old when he walked out. What the justice system handed back to the world in 1989 was a man who had beaten another person to death with a hammer, strangled the body, hidden it in a cupboard, and then spent the dead man's money without missing a beat. 5 years was what that cost him. 5 years, a reduced sentence on appeal, and then the door opened and he was free. Len Delgatti got none of that. He was 49 years old when McLaughlin killed him. He was found in a cupboard. His family had no answers until a drunk driver crashed a car and happened to be carrying his credit card. That is how his death came to light. Not through detective work, not through a confession, not through any functioning of the justice system working as it should. Through an accident. McLaughlin grew up in Cumbria and had been in trouble with police repeatedly as a child. By the time he killed Delgatti, he was a young man with a history of problems and a violent streak that had already made itself known. The Delgatti killing was not a sudden explosion from nowhere. It was the first documented endpoint of a pattern that had been building for years. McLaughlin beat a 49-year-old man with a hammer, finished him off with a towel around his throat, and then hid what he had done. That is not a crime of momentary panic. That is a series of deliberate actions taken one after the other. The manslaughter conviction, rather than murder, meant the court accepted some degree of reduced culpability. The 10-year sentence meant the judge considered this serious. The reduction to 8 years on appeal meant the legal system found grounds to pull that number down further. And the 5 years actually served meant that by 1989, Ian McLaughlin was a free man, having killed Len Delgatti in 1983 and hidden the body in a cupboard. It is worth being specific about what 5 years represents against what McLaughlin did. Delgatti was struck with a hammer multiple times. He was then strangled with a towel. His body was concealed. His belongings were taken and used. McLaughlin was not caught through any investigation into Delgatti's death. He was caught because he crashed a car while drunk. 5 years later, he was released. Len Delgatti remained dead. What happened after that release is the part that makes the Delgatti case impossible to look at in isolation. Because McLaughlin did not leave prison and build a quiet life, he moved to Brighton. He found work in the pub trade. He met a barman named Peter Halls. And within a few years of walking out of prison as a convicted killer, McLaughlin killed again. The justice system would later have to reckon with exactly this sequence of events. An official report submitted to the Justice Secretary in 2015, compiled by the Chief Inspector of Prisons, Nick Hardwick, would lay out McLaughlin's history in plain terms. It would note the manslaughter conviction. It would note the murder conviction that followed. It would note that McLaughlin had then admitted to a third killing during the same period, a killing for which no body was ever found and no charges were ever brought. And it would conclude that when McLaughlin was granted day release in July 2013, the risks he presented had not been sufficiently assessed or managed. But in 1989, none of that report existed yet. What existed was a man with one manslaughter conviction, a reduced sentence, 5 years served, and a release on licence. The system processed him and let him go. Len Delgatti had been in that cupboard in Stoke Newington. Peter Halls was in Brighton, running his pubs, not yet knowing that Ian McLaughlin was coming. The Delgatti case established something that would define every interaction McLaughlin had with the justice system from that point forward. He killed. He hid it. He was caught by chance. He served less than his sentence. He was released. And he killed again. That cycle would repeat itself with grim consistency across 3 decades, ending in a quiet Hertfordshire village on a Saturday afternoon in July 2013, when a 66-year-old retired company director heard shouting from his neighbour's garden and walked over to see what was wrong. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before July 2013, there was Brighton. And before Brighton, there was an admission McLaughlin made to police about a man he claimed to have killed in 1990. A man whose body was never found, a killing that was never prosecuted, and a file that sat somewhere in a system that would later grant McLaughlin the day release that cost Graeme Buck his life. The third killing McLaughlin admitted to, no body found. Between his release from prison in 1989 and his conviction for the murder of Peter Halls in 1992, Ian McLaughlin told police he had killed a man. He said he believed the man was a paedophile. No body was ever found. No charges were ever brought. No police action was taken. This is not a rumour or a claim made by a third party. McLaughlin volunteered this information himself. It is documented in the official report compiled by Nick Hardwick, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, and submitted directly to the Justice Secretary. The report states it without ambiguity. In 1991, McLaughlin claimed to police that he had killed another man in 1990. He believed that man to be a paedophile. No body was ever found, and no action followed. Sit with that for a moment. A man who had already been convicted of killing Len Delgatti in 1983 walked out of prison in 1989, and within a year told police he had killed again. He was not arrested. He was not charged. He was not placed back in custody. The admission was received, noted, and nothing happened. McLaughlin remained free. In 1992, he was arrested for the murder of Peter Halls in Brighton. That killing could be proven. There was a body, there was physical evidence, there was a crime scene. McLaughlin was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years. He went back to prison. And the 1990 admission, the one with no body and no prosecution, became part of his file, a fact on record, a thing that had happened and been acknowledged and then absorbed into the paperwork. What that file now contained by 1992 was significant. A manslaughter conviction for killing Len Delgatti with a hammer in 1983, a self-reported killing in 1990 that could not be prosecuted, a murder conviction for killing Peter Halls in 1992, 3 killings, 2 convictions, 1 admission sitting unresolved in a folder somewhere inside the system that would be responsible for managing McLaughlin for the next 2 decades. The official report that eventually examined how McLaughlin came to be on day release in July 2013 did not flinch from stating what his record looked like. It described him as a man who had previously been convicted of manslaughter and had committed at least 1 murder, noting the plural nature of his history clearly. The report was written after Graeme Buck was already dead, but the information it drew on had existed for years before that Saturday afternoon in Little Gaddesden. This is the part that does not have a clean explanation. The 1990 admission was not hidden. McLaughlin told police himself. It was recorded. It became part of his history. And yet, when the prison system at HMP Spring Hill was making decisions about his suitability for temporary release in 2013, the Chief Inspector of Prisons would later conclude that the risks he presented had not been sufficiently assessed or managed. The question of whether that unresolved admission played any role in that failure is not one the available records answer directly. What the records do answer is that McLaughlin had 3 killings attached to his name before he ever set foot outside Spring Hill on July 13, 2013. And the decision to let him out was made anyway. There is something specific about the nature of this admission that makes it sit differently from the other 2 killings. The Delgatti manslaughter was proven in court. The Halls murder was proven in court. The 1990 killing exists only because McLaughlin said it happened. He chose to tell police. He gave them a reason, that he believed the man was a paedophile. He offered this information and police could not corroborate it with a body or a crime scene. That combination, a voluntary confession with no physical evidence to act on, left the justice system with nothing it could prosecute and nowhere to go. What it did have was a clearer picture of who Ian McLaughlin was, a man who had killed in 1983 and hidden the body in a cupboard, a man who, by his own account, had killed again in 1990, a man who killed Peter Halls in Brighton sometime around 1991 and was convicted of that murder in 1992. 3 times, over roughly a decade. Each killing followed by McLaughlin continuing to function, continuing to move around, continuing to exist inside normal life, until something forced the issue. The pattern across all 3 is consistent. McLaughlin killed. He did not immediately fall apart, or seek help, or turn himself in. He carried on. In 1983, he used Delgatti's credit card and drove around until he crashed. In 1990, he killed a man, told police about it a year later, and faced no consequences. In 1992, he killed Peter Halls and was finally back in custody for a sentence that would last more than 2 decades. 21 years into that sentence, in 2013, a prison board decided he was ready to begin taking supervised steps outside. The official report that examined that decision afterwards found it was wrong. It found that his risk on temporary release had not been properly evaluated. It found that his history, all of it, including the 2 previous failures he had accumulated during his time in the prison system, had not been weighed as it should have been. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Those 2 previous failures inside the system are their own story. In 2004, McLaughlin absconded from HMP Kirkham following allegations of a sexual assault on another prisoner. In 2011, he failed to return to HMP Spring Hill from a release on temporary licence after becoming involved in a drunken altercation. Both of those failures were on record by July 2013. Neither of them stopped the day release that killed Graeme Buck. But to understand how McLaughlin ended up at HMP Spring Hill in the first place, and why his minimum term had stretched to 21 years before any outside access was even considered, you need to go back to Brighton, to a pub barman named Peter Halls, and to the murder that put McLaughlin away for the second, and what should have been, the final time. The murder of Peter Halls, Brighton, 1992. Ian McLaughlin was released from prison in 1989 after serving 5 years for the manslaughter of Len Delgatti. He moved to Brighton. He found his way into the pub trade, which in the early 1990s in Brighton meant a particular world of late nights, regulars, and people who knew each other through the industry. Peter Halls was part of that world. He was 56 years old. He ran several pubs in the city, including the Volks Tavern on Madeira Drive in Kemp Town, and he offered McLaughlin work. The 2 men spent time together. At some point, McLaughlin went back to Halls's flat in Silwood Road, Brighton. Peter Halls was stabbed to death in that flat. He was stabbed in the neck. His body was found there. McLaughlin was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder. On July 2nd, 1992, he was sentenced to life imprisonment at Lewes Crown Court with a minimum term of 25 years. He was 34 years old when that sentence was handed down. A 25-year minimum meant he could not even begin to be considered for parole until he had served a quarter of a century. He had already served 5 years for killing Len Delgatti. Now he was looking at 25 more before anyone would assess whether he was safe to release. What had happened between 1989 and 1992 tells its own story. McLaughlin left prison, moved to a new city, built connections in the pub trade, and within a few years had killed again. In between, by his own account given to police in 1991, he had killed a third man whose body was never found. So the sequence from the outside looking in was released 1989, admitted killing in 1990, convicted of murder in 1992, sentenced to a minimum of 25 years, 3 killings in roughly a decade, 2 convictions, 1 admission that went nowhere. The Brighton murder was the one that closed the door. A 25-year minimum is a serious sentence. It meant McLaughlin would be in his late 50s before parole could even be discussed. It meant that whatever decisions the prison system made about his progression through custody, the timeline was long and the expectations were clear. He was a convicted murderer with a prior manslaughter conviction, serving a life sentence with a substantial minimum term. He went into the prison system and spent more than 2 decades there. During that time, he was transferred between institutions. He spent 3 years in the therapeutic community at HMP Grendon, a prison specifically designed around psychological rehabilitation, where prisoners engage in group therapy as the central part of their daily life. He completed alcohol programs. He completed offending behaviour work. His custodial behaviour, according to the official report later compiled by the Chief Inspector of Prisons, was described as good. The prison had no security intelligence concerns about his conduct inside, but good behaviour inside a prison and reduced risk outside a prison are not the same thing. The official report made this distinction clearly. It acknowledged that McLaughlin had engaged with rehabilitation programs. It acknowledged his conduct within the prison walls had not caused concern. And then it stated plainly that he presented a concerning risk profile, that his history had not been sufficiently assessed when it came to temporary release, and that the decision to grant him that release had catastrophic consequences. The 2 failures McLaughlin accumulated during his sentence sit between the Brighton conviction and the 2013 day release. In 2004, while at HMP Kirkham, he absconded following allegations of a sexual assault on another prisoner. That failure resulted in him being returned to closed conditions. In 2011, he was at HMP Spring Hill and was granted a release on temporary licence. He did not return. He had become involved in a drunken altercation with a man previously unknown to him. That was his second failure of open conditions. After the 2011 failure, he was pulled back. The 2013 day release was, according to the official report, his first opportunity to be released on temporary licence since that 2011 failure. So the picture, by July 2013, was this. A man with a manslaughter conviction for killing with a hammer, a self-reported killing that was never prosecuted, a murder conviction for stabbing a man in the neck, 2 failures of open conditions over the course of his sentence, 1 involving an absconding and allegations of assault, 1 involving a drunken altercation serious enough to end his temporary licence, and a prison system that, according to the Chief Inspector of Prisons, did not sufficiently assess the risks before granting him another chance outside. HMP Spring Hill, where McLaughlin was held in 2013, is an open prison located near Grendon Underwood in Buckinghamshire. Open prisons operate on a different basis from closed prisons. Prisoners are not behind the same physical security. The model is built around preparing people for release, giving them supervised access to the outside world as part of a structured rehabilitation process. That process, when it works, is genuinely valuable. The problem at Spring Hill in 2013 was not the concept of temporary release. The problem was that a man with McLaughlin's specific and documented history had been placed in that system without the risks being properly weighed. When McLaughlin walked out of Spring Hill on July 13, 2013, he had a destination. He was not wandering. He knew exactly where he was going. During his years in prison, he had met a man named Francis Corey Wright, an 86-year-old former prisoner who had served time for historic child sex offences. Corey Wright lived in the village of Little Gaddesden in Hertfordshire, in a house on Nettledon Road. McLaughlin had a plan before he ever left the prison gate, and that plan had nothing to do with the supervised resettlement the day release was designed to facilitate. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened at Nettledon Road that afternoon began with McLaughlin arriving at Corey Wright's house and, according to the detective leading the investigation, an initial conversation between the two men that was cordial. It did not stay that way for long, and 2 doors down, a 66-year-old retired company director named Graeme Buck was at home, not yet knowing that anything was wrong next door. Graeme Buck, the man who was killed. Graeme Buck was 66 years old on July 13, 2013. He lived in Little Gaddesden, a small village in Hertfordshire near the town of Berkhamsted. He had spent his career in the financial industry, working his way to the level of company director before retiring. He was a father of 3 and a grandfather. He lived 2 doors away from Francis Corey Wright on Nettledon Road. That proximity, 2 doors between his home and his neighbours, is the only reason Graeme Buck's name appears in this story at all. Little Gaddesden is the kind of English village where people know their neighbours. It is small, quiet, and set in the Hertfordshire countryside. It is not the kind of place where people expect violence. It is not the kind of place where a convicted killer on day release from an open prison turns up with a plan to rob an elderly man and ends up stabbing someone to death in the kitchen. Nothing in Graeme Buck's life had prepared him for what was about to happen, because nothing in a normal life in a village like Little Gaddesden would. He was a retired man. He had his family. He had his neighbours. He had the kind of existence that most people would consider safe. On the afternoon of July 13, 2013, Buck heard shouting coming from the direction of Francis Corey Wright's house. Corey Wright was 86 years old and lived alone. He was elderly and vulnerable. Whatever was happening next door sounded like someone who needed help. So Graeme Buck did what a decent person does when they hear their elderly neighbour in distress. He went to find out what was wrong. He walked 2 doors down Nettledon Road. He came to Corey Wright's house. Inside that house, Ian McLaughlin had already tied Corey Wright up and searched the property. He had filled a pillowcase with family heirlooms. He was on his way out. What happened next is documented in witness accounts from the time. Buck was grabbed. He was put in a headlock. He was dragged into the kitchen. McLaughlin stabbed him. Graeme Buck, a 66-year-old retired company director who had done nothing except respond to the sound of his neighbour in distress, was stabbed to death in a kitchen he had never been in before that afternoon. He had not gone looking for trouble. He had not confronted McLaughlin aggressively. He had heard shouting and walked over. That is the full extent of what Graeme Buck did to end up dead on July 13, 2013. He heard something that concerned him, and he acted on it, the same way most people would like to think they would act if they heard an elderly neighbour crying out. It cost him everything. Detective Chief Superintendent Jeff Hill, who spoke publicly about the case in the days after the murder, described Buck as a man who had paid the ultimate price for intervening during the robbery at the home of an elderly neighbour. That description is accurate, and it is also insufficient, because it frames what happened as an intervention in a robbery, which implies some kind of understood risk. There was no understood risk for Graeme Buck. He did not know a convicted murderer was inside that house. He did not know a robbery was taking place. He heard shouting. He went to help. The gap between those two things, what he knew and what was actually happening, is the gap that killed him. Francis Corey Wright, the man Buck had gone to help, survived the attack. He was injured and was taken to hospital, but he was discharged and moved to a place of safety. The pillowcase full of family heirlooms that McLaughlin had gathered before Buck arrived was recovered as part of the subsequent investigation. Corey Wright had served a 30-month sentence in 2011 for indecently assaulting a 10-year-old boy in the 1970s. He and Buck were not connected in any way beyond living near each other on Nettledon Road. Buck had no knowledge of Corey Wright's history that would have changed the calculation for him. He was a neighbour who needed help. Buck went. The Buck family lost a father and a grandfather that afternoon. A man who had worked a full career, reached the level of company director in the financial industry, retired, and was living out his later years in a quiet Hertfordshire village. His 3 children lost their father. His grandchildren lost their grandfather. All of it taken on a Saturday afternoon because a prison in Buckinghamshire put a 3-time killer on a bus and sent him out into the community without adequately assessing what he was likely to do with his freedom. What followed the killing was a manhunt. Police issued an urgent public appeal for information about McLaughlin's whereabouts. They warned the public not to approach him under any circumstances. Ports, airports, and police forces across the country were alerted. McLaughlin was described as a very dangerous man. They issued a physical description: a white male around 6 feet tall with greying hair, last seen wearing sunglasses, blue jeans, and a checked short-sleeved shirt. They noted he was believed to be carrying a large amount of £50 and £20 notes, taken during the robbery of Corey Wright's home, cash he might use to fund his movements and conceal his location. He did not get far. McLaughlin went on a drinking binge after leaving Little Gaddesden and ended up at a friend's house in Tottenham, North London. Police traced him there after receiving reports of men arguing at the address. In the early hours of the morning following the murder, Metropolitan police officers arrested him at that address. He had been free for less than a day. 3 other people were arrested in Tottenham at the same time: a 54-year-old man, a 45-year-old woman, and a 50-year-old man, all on suspicion of assisting an offender. 2 of them were later charged with that offence. McLaughlin himself was charged with murder, robbery, and possession of cannabis. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Graeme Buck was dead. The man who killed him was in custody within hours, caught the same way he had been caught the first time, through drink, through disorder, through an inability to hold himself together long enough to stay hidden. And now the question the country would spend the next several months asking was not whether McLaughlin had done it, but how he had been allowed out of prison in the first place to do it at all. The day release, the prison, and what McLaughlin did with it. HMP. Spring Hill is an open prison located near Grendon Underwood in Buckinghamshire. Open prisons sit at the lowest security end of the custodial estate. There are no high walls, no watchtowers, no physical barriers designed to prevent a determined person from walking away. The model is built on trust and structured progression. Prisoners who have moved through the closed prison system and are considered suitable are transferred to open conditions as part of a managed process of preparing them for eventual release back into the community. The theory is sound. A prisoner who goes straight from a closed cell to complete freedom with nothing in between is harder to rehabilitate than one who has been gradually reintroduced to the outside world under supervision. Temporary release, known formally as Release on Temporary Licence or ROTL, is a central part of that process. On 13th July 2013, Ian McLaughlin walked out of HMP Spring Hill on a temporary licence. It was the first time he had been outside a prison unsupervised in 21 years. He was 55 years old. He had a manslaughter conviction from 1984. He had a murder conviction from 1992. He had told police in 1991 that he had killed a 3rd man, a claim that was never prosecuted because no body was ever found. He had failed open conditions twice during his sentence, once in 2004 when he absconded from HMP Kirkham following allegations of a sexual assault on another prisoner, and once in 2011 when he failed to return to Spring Hill from a temporary licence after becoming involved in a drunken altercation with a man he did not know. The 2013 day release was his first opportunity for temporary release since that 2011 failure. None of that stopped the licence being granted. McLaughlin did not use his day release to visit family, find employment contacts, or engage with any of the rehabilitation purposes that temporary licence is designed to serve. He had a specific destination in mind before he left the prison. That destination was the home of Francis Corey Wright, an 86-year-old man living in the village of Little Gaddesden in Hertfordshire. McLaughlin and Corey Wright had met while both were serving time in prison. Corey Wright had been convicted in 2011 and sentenced to 30 months for indecently assaulting a 10-year-old boy in the 1970s. McLaughlin knew where he lived. He went there. Detective Chief Inspector Martin Brunning, who led the investigation, said publicly that when McLaughlin arrived at Corey Wright's home, there was, for some considerable time, a cordial conversation going on between the two men. What shifted that conversation, and when, is not entirely clear from the public record. What is clear is that at some point, McLaughlin moved from visitor to attacker. He tied Corey Wright up. He searched the house. He filled a pillowcase with family heirlooms. He was preparing to leave with what he had taken when Graeme Buck knocked at the door, having heard shouting from 2 doors down. What followed took seconds, in the way that violence always does. Buck was grabbed, put in a headlock, and dragged into the kitchen. McLaughlin stabbed him. Graeme Buck died in that kitchen. McLaughlin left. He went on a drinking binge. He ended up at a friend's house in Tottenham. He was arrested in the early hours of the following morning when police responded to reports of men arguing at that address. He had been free for less than a day. He had spent that freedom committing a robbery, killing a man, and drinking until the police found him. The prison that had granted that licence knew McLaughlin's history. That is the part that the official investigation into what happened would later find impossible to excuse. The Chief Inspector of Prisons, Nick Hardwick, compiled a report that was submitted to the Justice Secretary and made public in March 2015. It was methodical, and it was damning. It did not find that Spring Hill had been unaware of McLaughlin's background. It found that the background had not been properly weighed. The report noted that McLaughlin's custodial behaviour had been good and that the prison had no security intelligence concerns about his conduct inside. It also noted that he had completed significant amounts of offending behaviour work, including alcohol programmes and 3 years in the therapeutic community at HMP Grendon. On paper, inside the walls, McLaughlin had done what the system asked him to do. The problem was that inside behaviour and outside risk are different measurements, and the report found the outside risk had not been adequately assessed. The report's language on this point was direct. It said McLaughlin presented a concerning risk profile. It said he had previously been convicted of manslaughter and had committed at least 1 murder. It said he had failed open conditions twice before. It said the 2013 release was his first opportunity since the 2011 failure, a failure that had itself involved a drunken altercation with a stranger. And it concluded that the risks he presented on temporary release were not sufficiently assessed or managed. Behind that conclusion was a second finding about the environment in which those decisions were being made. Spring Hill in 2013 was not the same prison it had been a few years earlier. In April 2011, it held 20 prisoners serving indeterminate sentences. By August 2012, that number had risen to 111. The prison was housing 335 adult male prisoners in total. Boards were being held each week to process temporary release decisions across a population that had changed dramatically in its composition. The number of high-risk, indeterminate sentenced prisoners had increased more than 5-fold in 14 months. The staff making weekly licence decisions were doing so under conditions that had shifted significantly beneath them. That context does not transfer the responsibility away from the institution or the individuals who signed off on McLaughlin's licence. It explains the environment in which that failure occurred. A system under pressure processing decisions at volume about a population of prisoners that had grown rapidly and included men with the kind of histories that demand more time and more scrutiny than a weekly board meeting under resource strain can reliably provide. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The official report's final verdict on McLaughlin's release used the word catastrophic. It said the decision to grant the licence and the way the release had been managed represented a fundamental failure of the system. Graeme Buck was dead. Corey Wright had survived. McLaughlin was back in custody within hours. And the question of who was accountable for putting him outside those gates was now sitting in front of the Justice Secretary, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, and eventually the Houses of Parliament. The systemic failures, what the official report found. Nick Hardwick was the Chief Inspector of Prisons in England and Wales when his office compiled the report into what had gone wrong at HMP Spring Hill. The report was completed in January 2014, 6 months after Graeme Buck was killed. It was not made public until March 2015. When it was released, it did not use careful diplomatic language designed to protect the institution. It said what it found. And what it found was a failure at multiple levels, running from the individual risk assessment of Ian McLaughlin all the way through to the structural conditions inside which that assessment had been made. The report was addressed to Chris Grayling, who was serving as Justice Secretary at the time. It laid out McLaughlin's history in sequence. The 1984 manslaughter conviction for killing Len Delgatti, the 1991 admission to police that he had killed a third man whose body was never found, the 1992 murder conviction for killing Peter Halls in Brighton. 3 killings, 2 convictions, 1 unresolved admission, all of it on record. All of it available to anyone making decisions about McLaughlin's management inside the prison system. The report then laid out what had happened during McLaughlin's sentence itself. In 2004, he had absconded from HMP Kirkham. The circumstances around that absconding included allegations of a sexual assault on another prisoner. That failure resulted in him being returned to closed conditions. Then in 2011, he was granted a release on temporary licence from HMP Spring Hill and did not return. He had become involved in a drunken altercation with a man previously unknown to him. That was his second failure of open conditions. The 2013 day release, the one that ended with Graeme Buck dead in a kitchen in Little Gaddesden, was his first opportunity for temporary release since that 2011 failure. The report's summary of this history was unambiguous. It stated that McLaughlin had previously been convicted of manslaughter and had committed at least 1 murder. It stated he had failed open conditions twice before. It stated that the risks he presented on release on temporary licence had not been sufficiently assessed or managed. That last sentence is the one that matters most, because it is the one that explains how a man with that specific and documented history was handed a day licence and sent out into a Hertfordshire village with no adequate mechanism in place to monitor what he did with it. What the report also found was that the failure was not purely about McLaughlin as an individual. It was about the environment inside which decisions about people like him were being made. Spring Hill in 2013 was an open prison operating under significant pressure. In April 2011, it had held 20 prisoners serving indeterminate sentences. By August 2012, that number had risen to 111. The prison held 335 adult male prisoners in total. Boards were convening every week to process temporary release decisions across a population that had been transformed in its composition over a very short period of time. That 5-fold increase in indeterminate sentenced prisoners in 14 months did not come with a corresponding increase in the resources needed to assess them properly. The staff responsible for making weekly licence decisions were doing so in conditions that had shifted dramatically beneath them, with more prisoners, more complex histories, and more decisions to make. The report found that Spring Hill was struggling to enforce the more robust assessment procedures that were introduced in the immediate aftermath of the Buck murder. An unannounced inspection of the prison found staff stretched to breaking point trying to operate under the tightened regime that the killing had prompted. The report also addressed McLaughlin's conduct inside the prison system, because his behaviour within the walls had not been the problem. His custodial behaviour was described as good. The prison had no security intelligence concerns about him. He had completed substantial offending behaviour work during his sentence. He had spent 3 years in the therapeutic community at HMP Grendon, which is one of the most intensive rehabilitation environments available within the English prison system. He had completed alcohol programmes. On the measures available to the institution for assessing internal conduct, McLaughlin had performed adequately. The report drew a clear line between those internal measures and the question of external risk. Good behaviour in a closed environment does not automatically translate into safe behaviour in an open one. McLaughlin's 2 previous failures of open conditions were the evidence of that gap, and the report found that those failures had not been given sufficient weight when the 2013 licence was approved. The first failure had involved absconding and allegations of assault. The second had involved a drunken confrontation with a stranger serious enough to end his temporary licence. Both were on his record. Neither was treated as disqualifying. Michael Spur, who was Chief Executive of the National Offender Management Service at the time the report was published, acknowledged publicly that the murder had led to a fundamental review and tightening of temporary release arrangements at Spring Hill and across the prison service. He said the procedures were now more robust and that more intensive risk assessment processes were in place. He said public safety was the top priority and that the service would ensure establishments had the resources to undertake the more rigorous assessment process now required. That statement was made in September 2014, 14 months after Graeme Buck was killed. The more rigorous processes it described were a direct consequence of his death. They had not existed in the form required on July 13, 2013. They existed because of what happened on the 13th of July 2013. Graeme Buck did not benefit from them. He could not. He was already dead. The report's conclusion used 2 specific words that defined how the official record would characterise what Spring Hill had done. It called the decision to release McLaughlin inappropriate. It called the consequences catastrophic. Between those 2 words sits the full weight of what the failure had produced. A man who should not have been outside was outside. A man who had no reason to die was dead. And a prison system that had the information it needed to make a different decision had not used it well enough to matter. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What came next moved the case beyond the prison walls and into Parliament, where the question of how someone like McLaughlin had been handed a day release was being asked not just by inspectors and civil servants, but by elected representatives demanding answers on behalf of the public. That conversation would lead directly to a national review of how the entire temporary release system operated, and it would do so because Graeme Buck's death had made it impossible to look away. The overcrowding problem behind the failure. The failure that killed Graeme Buck did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a specific institution, at a specific moment in that institution's history, when the population it was managing had changed faster than the systems designed to manage it could keep up with. Understanding what Spring Hill looked like in 2013 does not excuse what happened, but it does explain the conditions inside which a weekly board meeting could look at Ian McLaughlin's file and wave him through the gate. HMP Spring Hill sits near Grendon Underwood in Buckinghamshire. It is an open prison, which means its entire operating model is built around the assumption that the people inside it are being prepared for life outside. Temporary release is not a bonus or a privilege in that context. It is a core function. The prison exists in part to facilitate supervised reintegration. That is what open prisons are for. When they work as intended, they reduce reoffending by giving prisoners a structured and managed route back into the community, rather than a sudden and unsupported transition from a closed cell to complete freedom. The problem at Spring Hill in 2013 was not the model. The problem was what had happened to the population the model was being applied to. In April 2011, Spring Hill held 20 prisoners serving indeterminate sentences. Indeterminate sentences are those without a fixed end date. Life sentences fall into this category. Prisoners serving indeterminate sentences require more careful risk assessment than those serving fixed terms, because the question of when and how they are released involves a more complex evaluation of ongoing risk. 20 such prisoners in April 2011 was a manageable number, within a total population of several hundred. By August 2012, the number of indeterminate sentence prisoners at Spring Hill had risen to 111. That is an increase of more than 5-fold in 14 months. The total prison population at the time was 335 adult male prisoners. 1 in 3 of the men inside Spring Hill by August 2012 was serving an indeterminate sentence. A year earlier, fewer than 1 in 15 had been. That shift did not happen because Spring Hill had changed its intake criteria in any deliberate way. It happened because of broader pressures within the prison system, pushing prisoners with indeterminate sentences toward open conditions as part of their progression. The receiving institution, Spring Hill, absorbed that shift without a corresponding increase in the resources needed to assess the people arriving. The boards convening each week to make temporary release decisions were making more of them, about more complex cases, with the same capacity they had when the population looked very different. The Chief Inspector of Prisons report that examined McLaughlin's release found this context directly relevant to what had gone wrong. It noted the dramatic increase in indeterminate sentenced prisoners at Spring Hill and connected it to the conditions under which risk assessments were being conducted. A board making weekly decisions about temporary release across a population that had tripled in its proportion of high-risk indeterminate prisoners is a board under strain. Strain does not make failures inevitable, but it makes them more likely, particularly when the cases being assessed include men like McLaughlin, whose files required more time and more scrutiny than a pressurized weekly process could reliably guarantee. The inspection that followed the Buck murder found that even the tightened procedures introduced in response to the killing were placing staff under significant pressure. An unannounced inspection of Spring Hill found staff stretched to breaking point, enforcing the more robust assessment regime that had been put in place after July 2013. If the post-murder procedures were already stretching the institution's capacity, the pre-murder procedures were operating in conditions that were less robust still. This matters because it reframes the failure slightly, without shifting the responsibility. The decision to release McLaughlin was wrong. The assessment of his risk was inadequate. Those are facts established by the official report, but the context in which that inadequate assessment was made was one of institutional overload, where a prison designed and resourced for a particular kind of population was managing a very different one, under weekly decision-making pressure, without the additional capacity that the changed population required. Michael Spur, the chief executive of the National Offender Management Service, acknowledged in September 2014 that the murder had triggered a fundamental review of temporary release arrangements across the entire prison service, not just at Spring Hill. That language, across the entire prison service, signals that what Spring Hill was experiencing was not unique to Spring Hill. The pressures that had produced the conditions in which McLaughlin's risk was inadequately assessed were systemic. They existed in varying degrees across the open prison estate. The Buck murder forced those pressures into public view in the most brutal way possible. The review that followed tightened the criteria for temporary release for prisoners with serious violent histories. It required more intensive risk assessment processes. It placed greater emphasis on the gap between custodial behaviour and release risk, the same gap the Hardwick report had identified as the one that Spring Hill had failed to bridge when it came to McLaughlin. Whether those changes have held, and whether the resource pressures that produced the original failure have been adequately addressed, is a question that the prison system has continued to face in the years since 2013. What is not in question is the specific arithmetic of what happened at Spring Hill between April 2011 and July 2013. 20 indeterminate sentence prisoners became 111 in 14 months. The boards making weekly release decisions did not shrink in response to that growth. McLaughlin went in front of one of those boards. His 2 previous failures of open conditions were on his record. His history of 3 killings was on his record. His 2011 drunken altercation that had ended his last temporary licence was on his record. The board approved his release anyway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Graeme Buck was at home 2 doors from Francis Corey Wright when that decision was made. He had no idea it had been made. He had no reason to know. The decision was made in a room in a prison in Buckinghamshire by people working through a weekly list under institutional pressure, and its consequences arrived on Nettledon Road in Little Gaddesden on a Saturday afternoon in July 2013. The next question the country demanded an answer to was not just what had gone wrong inside Spring Hill, but what was going to be done about it at the highest levels of government. That question went all the way to Parliament. The arrest, the charges, and who helped McLaughlin. After Ian McLaughlin left Francis Corey Wright's house on Nettledon Road in Little Gaddesden on the afternoon of July 13, 2013, with a pillowcase full of stolen property and Graeme Buck dead on the kitchen floor, Corey Wright was injured but alive. McLaughlin walked away from what he had done the same way he had walked away from Len Delgatty's body in a cupboard in Stoke Newington 30 years earlier. He left. He did not call for help. He did not hand himself in. He went looking for somewhere to go and something to drink. What followed over the next several hours was not the behaviour of a man trying to evade capture through planning or discipline. McLaughlin went on a drinking binge. He made his way to Tottenham in North London, a journey of roughly 40 miles from Little Gaddesden. He ended up at a friend's house. He was not hiding in any sophisticated sense. He was drinking, in a house, in a part of London he knew, with people who knew him. The pillowcase of stolen property taken from Corey Wright's home included a substantial amount of cash, described by police as a large amount of £50 and £20 notes, money McLaughlin could use to move around and fund whatever came next. Hertfordshire Police issued an urgent public appeal for information about McLaughlin's whereabouts in the hours after Graeme Buck's body was found. Detective Chief Inspector Martin Brunning, leading the investigation for the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire Major Crime Unit, described McLaughlin as a very dangerous man and made clear the public should not approach him under any circumstances. A detailed physical description was released. McLaughlin was described as a white male, around 6 feet tall, with greying hair. He had last been seen wearing sunglasses, blue jeans, or possibly 3/4 length trousers, and a dark checked short-sleeved shirt with a button-down collar. Police noted specifically that he was believed to be carrying a significant amount of cash and might be using it to conceal his movements and pay for things without drawing attention. The hunt went national almost immediately. Ports were alerted. Airports across the country were put on notice. Police forces nationwide were notified. The public appeal specifically targeted guest house owners, hoteliers, people working in transport, and pub staff, asking them to be vigilant. The reasoning was straightforward. McLaughlin was known to drink heavily. He had cash. He was in a city or moving through one. The places a man like that is most likely to surface are the places that serve drinks and rent rooms without asking too many questions. He surfaced in Tottenham. Not because of the public appeal or the nationwide alert, but because of an argument. Police received reports of men arguing at a residential address in Tottenham. Officers from the Metropolitan Police attended. Ian McLaughlin was there. In the early hours of the morning following the murder, less than 24 hours after he had stabbed Graeme Buck to death in Little Gaddesden, McLaughlin was arrested. The Metropolitan Police made the arrest. The investigation was being run by the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire Major Crime Unit, and it was their work in the hours between the murder and the arrest that had traced McLaughlin to North London. He was not alone when police arrived. 3 other people were at the address, or connected to it, and were arrested at the same time. A 54-year-old man from Tottenham, a 45-year-old woman from Edmonton in North London, a 50-year-old man from Hackney. All 3 were arrested on suspicion of assisting an offender. They were taken to Hatfield Police Station in Hertfordshire, along with McLaughlin, and questioned. 2 of the 3 were subsequently charged with assisting an offender. The 3rd was not charged. That detail, the 3 people arrested alongside McLaughlin, is one that tends to get lost in the larger story of the case. But it matters. McLaughlin did not spend the hours after killing Graeme Buck alone and frightened in a corner somewhere. He spent them with people. People who knew him, who let him into their home, and who, in the case of 2 of them, were subsequently charged by police with having assisted him after the offence. Whether those people knew what McLaughlin had done that afternoon, and when they knew it, is not something the public record fully answers. What the public record does establish is that 2 of them faced criminal charges for the help they provided. McLaughlin himself was charged with 3 offences: murder for the killing of Graeme Buck, robbery for the theft of property from Francis Corey Wright's home, and possession of cannabis. He was brought before Hatfield Remand Court the day after his arrest. He was remanded in custody. He would remain there as the legal process moved toward trial. Corey Wright, the man McLaughlin had gone to rob that afternoon, had been discharged from hospital by the time McLaughlin appeared in court. Police confirmed he had been moved to a place of safety. He was 86 years old. He had been tied up in his own home by a man he had known from prison, and his neighbour had been killed in his kitchen while coming to help him. The family heirlooms stolen from his house were recovered as part of the investigation. The speed of McLaughlin's arrest, less than a day, caught through an argument at a friend's house in Tottenham, rather than through any deliberate act of surrender, echoed the way he had been caught after the Delgatti killing in 1983. Both times he was undone by alcohol and disorder, rather than by detective work closing in on a careful fugitive. Both times he was found not because he had made a mistake in his planning, but because he had no real plan beyond drinking and finding somewhere to sit with people he knew. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The charges were filed, the remand was in place, and the legal process that would eventually take McLaughlin to the Old Bailey, where he would stand and admit what he had done, was now underway. What happened in that courtroom, and what the judge decided to do with a 55-year-old man who had now killed 3 times, would become a legal argument that went far beyond the case itself and reached the Court of Appeal, the Attorney General, and a question about whether English courts could lock someone up for the rest of their natural life and call it lawful. The guilty plea, the original sentence, and the Attorney General's intervention. Ian McLaughlin appeared at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey in London, on 21st of October 2013. He was 55 years old. He had been in custody since his arrest in Tottenham in the early hours of 14th July, 3 months earlier. When his case was called, he pleaded guilty to the murder of Graeme Buck. He also pleaded guilty to the robbery of Francis Corey Wright's home on Nettledon Road. The trial that might have been was not necessary. McLaughlin admitted what he had done. The guilty plea meant there was no prolonged courtroom process, no prosecution building its case day by day, no defence attempting to construct an alternative account of what had happened in Little Gaddesden on 13th July 2013. McLaughlin stood before the court and confirmed it. He had gone to Corey Wright's house on day release from HMP Spring Hill. He had robbed it. He had killed Graeme Buck when Buck came to his neighbour's aid. He pleaded guilty to both offences. The sentencing fell to Mr. Justice Sweeney, sitting at the Central Criminal Court. For the murder, McLaughlin was sentenced to life imprisonment. For the robbery, he received a concurrent sentence of 8 years, meaning the 8 years would run alongside the life sentence, rather than being added on top of it. The significant question was not whether McLaughlin would receive a life sentence. That was never in doubt for a murder conviction. The significant question was what minimum term the judge would attach to that life sentence, meaning how many years McLaughlin would have to serve before he could even be considered for parole. Mr. Justice Sweeney fixed the minimum term at 40 years. At 55 years old, a 40-year minimum meant McLaughlin would be 95 before he could be considered for release. In practical terms, for a man of his age, a 40-year minimum and a whole life order, which carries no minimum term at all because the prisoner is never eligible for parole, produce roughly the same outcome. McLaughlin was not going to live to be 95, but legally, technically, and in terms of what the sentence communicated about the gravity of what he had done, there was a difference between the two. And that difference is what drove what happened next. The judge explained his decision not to impose a whole life order by reference to a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights. In 2012, the Strasbourg court had handed down a judgment in a case called Winter versus United Kingdom. That judgment had raised questions about whether whole life orders, sentences that offer a prisoner no possibility of release and no mechanism for review, were compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. The Winter ruling had created uncertainty in English courts about whether whole life orders could still be lawfully imposed. Mr. Justice Sweeney, sitting in October 2013 with that uncertainty unresolved, concluded that he was bound to pass a sentence that was compliant with the convention if he could do so. He determined it was not appropriate to impose a whole life order in those circumstances, even for a man of McLaughlin's history. He gave 40 years instead. 40 years was the longest minimum term ever fixed in a case referred under the unduly lenient sentence scheme. That scheme allows the Attorney General to refer a sentence to the Court of Appeal if it is considered too low. The Attorney General at the time was Dominic Grieve. In November 2013, 1 month after McLaughlin was sentenced, Grieve referred the 40-year minimum to the Court of Appeal on the grounds that it was unduly lenient. The referral was significant in itself. A 40-year minimum term for a man of 55 is, by any ordinary measure, an extraordinarily severe sentence. The fact that the Attorney General looked at that sentence and decided it was still not enough tells you something about how the case was being viewed at the highest levels of the legal system. Grieve's position was that the Winter ruling had not actually prevented English courts from imposing whole life orders in sufficiently serious cases. He believed the trial judge had misread the implications of the European Court of Human Rights judgment. He believed McLaughlin's case, a man who had now killed 3 times, who had committed his 3rd murder while on day release from a life sentence for his 2nd, was precisely the kind of case for which whole life orders existed. He asked the Court of Appeal to look again. The referral set up a legal confrontation that went well beyond McLaughlin as an individual. The Court of Appeal would have to decide not just whether 40 years was the right sentence for one 55-year-old man in one case, but whether English courts retained the power to impose whole life orders at all in the wake of the Winter ruling. That question had implications for every prisoner serving a whole life order in England and Wales, and for every future case in which a judge might consider imposing one. McLaughlin's case had become a vehicle for resolving one of the most significant questions in English sentencing law. A specially constituted court was assembled to hear the matter. It was headed by the Lord Chief Justice, and included Sir Brian Leveson, Lady Justice Hallett, Lord Justice Tracy, and Mr. Justice Burnett. The constitution of that court, its seniority and its size, reflected the weight of the question it had been asked to answer. This was not a routine appeal against a sentence. This was the Court of Appeal being asked to define the boundaries of the most severe punishment available in English law. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. McLaughlin's guilty plea, his original 40-year sentence, and the Attorney General's decision to refer it had created something larger than a single criminal case. They had created a legal moment. The court that would resolve it was now assembled. Graeme Buck's family, who had lost a husband, a father, and a grandfather to a man who should never have been outside a prison, were waiting to find out whether the sentence handed down for that loss would stand, or whether it would be replaced by something that communicated more clearly that Ian McLaughlin would die in prison. That answer came in February 2014, the whole life order and its legal significance. The Court of Appeal handed down its judgment in February 2014. The court that assembled to hear the case was not a routine panel. It was headed by the Lord Chief Justice and included some of the most senior judges in England and Wales. The question before them was not simply whether Ian McLaughlin's 40-year minimum term was too low. It was whether English courts retained the legal power to impose whole life orders at all, given what the European Court of Human Rights had said in the Winter ruling 2 years earlier. McLaughlin's case had arrived at the Court of Appeal carrying that larger question on its back, and the answer the court gave would shape English sentencing law for years beyond the case itself. The court found that the 40-year minimum term was unduly lenient. It substituted a whole life order. Ian McLaughlin, 55 years old at the time of sentencing and 56 by the time the appeal judgment came down, would never be considered for parole. He would die in prison. That was now the legal position, confirmed by the most senior criminal court in England and Wales, and it carried with it a body of reasoning that went far beyond one man's sentence. The Court of Appeal's position on the Winter ruling was direct. The judges found that the European Court of Human Rights had not, in fact, prohibited whole life orders. What Winter had required was that every prisoner serving a whole life order must have access to some mechanism for review, some process through which, in exceptional circumstances, release could be considered. English law already provided that mechanism through the Justice Secretary's power under Section 30 of the Crime Sentences Act 1997 to release a prisoner on compassionate grounds. The Court of Appeal found that this provision, properly interpreted, satisfied the requirement that Winter had identified. Whole life orders in England and Wales were therefore compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. The trial judge had been wrong to conclude otherwise. That finding had immediate consequences beyond McLaughlin. Every prisoner in England and Wales serving a whole life order had their sentence confirmed as lawful by this judgment. Every future judge considering whether to impose a whole life order now had clear authority to do so in sufficiently serious cases. The uncertainty created by Winter, which had caused Mr. Justice Sweeney to step back from a whole life order at McLaughlin's original sentencing, was resolved. The Court of Appeal had drawn the line clearly, and McLaughlin's case was the vehicle through which it had done so. Attorney General Dominic Grieve responded to the judgment publicly. He said he was pleased the Court of Appeal had confirmed that those who commit the most heinous crimes can be sent to prison for the rest of their lives. He described McLaughlin as someone who had killed 3 times, and said that following the judgment, he had received the sentence that crime required. Grieve had asked the Court of Appeal to look again at the original sentence because he did not believe the European Court of Human Rights had said anything which prevented English courts from handing down whole life terms in the most serious cases. The Court of Appeal agreed with him. The legal significance of the judgment extended into territory that the McLaughlin case shared with another case heard at the same time. Lee Newell, a prisoner already serving a life sentence for murder, had killed a fellow prisoner named Subhan Anwar at HMP Long Lartin and had been given a whole life order for that killing. Newell had appealed his whole life order, arguing that it was incompatible with the Winter ruling. The Court of Appeal dismissed that appeal. The 2 cases, McLaughlin and Newell, were heard together, and the judgment addressed both. The court described them as exceptional and rare cases of second murders committed by persons serving the custodial part of a life sentence. That description applied equally to both men, and the judgment treated them as a pair of cases that together illustrated when whole life orders were not just appropriate, but required. For McLaughlin specifically, the court's reasoning rested on the accumulation of his history. A manslaughter conviction in 1984, a murder conviction in 1992, a third killing admitted to police in 1991, for which no prosecution had been possible, and then the murder of Graeme Buck in 2013, committed while on day release from the life sentence he was already serving for the second killing. The court looked at that sequence and found that the seriousness of the offending was at the highest possible level. A 40-year minimum, however severe it appeared in isolation, did not adequately reflect that. A whole life order did. The judgment also addressed something that the original sentencing had left unresolved, which was the question of what the law communicates when it sentences someone. A sentence is not purely a calculation of years. It is a statement about the gravity of what has been done, and the degree to which the person who did it can be considered safe to return to the community at any future point. The Court of Appeal's decision to impose a whole life order on McLaughlin communicated something specific. It said that there was no future point at which Ian McLaughlin's return to the community could be considered. Not in 10 years, not in 40 years, not ever. The door that had opened for him twice before, in 1989 after Delgatti and in 2013 after Halls, would not open a third time. McLaughlin was sent to serve that whole life order. He will not be released. He was 55 years old when he killed Graeme Buck, and 56 when the Court of Appeal confirmed he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Graeme Buck was 66 years old when he heard shouting from his neighbour's garden on a Saturday afternoon in July 2013 and walked 2 doors down Nettledon Road to see if someone needed help. He was a father of 3 and a grandfather. He had spent his career in the financial industry, retired, and was living in a quiet Hertfordshire village. He had no reason to know that the justice system had placed a 3-time killer on a bus from an open prison in Buckinghamshire and sent him to a house 2 doors from his own. He walked over because that is what decent people do. He did not walk back. And the man who made sure of that will spend every remaining day of his life inside a prison cell, which is the only outcome that the full weight of what he did could ever have justified. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.